Well, hello all. Today we're talking about limiting reagents. Grade 11 work. If you're following in Study and Masters, it's on page 193 of Study and Master. Now I thought if we're going to talk about limiting reagents or reactants, let's bake a loaf of bread. It's lockdown. I've forgotten which day it is, but we're out of bread, so let's make some bread. Now to make bread, we're going to need flour, water, oil, salt, yeast. Let's combine them. I've just remembered I haven't got the oil. Okay, so here we've got our baking bowl. We've got some yeast. What we need is 3 cups of flour. Let's see if we've got 3 cups of flour. 1, 2, 3 cups of flour. Lovely. Now we also need, I need to get some water. Now we need 1 cup of warm water. Yep, that's warm. 1 cup of warm water. We need 1 level tablespoon of yeast. There we go. 1 level tablespoon of yeast. We need sugar. So we need 2 heaped tablespoons of sugar. And we need 2 tablespoons of oil. And there we go. Now we just have to mix it all up and knead it a bit. And once that's all mixed up, we've got to leave it to stand. We leave it to stand, and then we bake it. And we make, here's our dough. And we just got to knead it up enough, and there we get our dough. You can see it forms quite a stiff dough. Right, now what has this got to do with our limiting reagents? So now we're just going to let the yeast do its magic. It's going to stay in a warm place and rise for 2 hours with us kneading it occasionally, and then we're going to bake it and get our bread. Here we are on page 193 of Study and Master Grade 11, Limiting Reagents. We briefly looked at limiting reagents in the previous example. Let us explain it in more detail. A balanced chemical equation tells us what mass or volume of reactants will react to form products. But what happens if we do not have the required amount of one of the reactants? So suppose I was baking bread, and I didn't have the yeast, or I didn't have the sugar, or I didn't have the flour, or I didn't have the water. What would happen? The limiting reactant or reagent is a substance that will be used up totally during the reaction. The amount of product is determined or limited by this reagent. So let's suppose that I only had half a tablespoon of yeast instead of the whole tablespoon. My limiting reagent would be that I would be forced to, if I wanted to bake decent bread, if I've got half the amount of yeast, I would be limited by that. I would be only able to make half a loaf of bread, or half the flour wouldn't rise. So I'd be wasting my dough, because only half of it would rise and wouldn't rise fully, or I'd have to make a plan and, maybe leave it for a day to rise. But you see, the limiting thing is what you got the least of. If I didn't have flour, say I only had 1 cup of flour instead of 3, but I had 2 tablespoons of yeast, my limiting reagent, would it be the yeast or would it be the flour? Well, if I've got enough yeast and I've got too little flour, I've only got 1/3 of the amount of flour, the flour is going to be my limiting reagent. So the limiting reactant or reagent is a substance that will be used up totally during the reaction. And if your amounts of ingredients are not balanced, it doesn't matter so much in baking bread, but when you're doing chemistry, you're going to find one substance going to be completely used up. Say you were burning hydrogen and oxygen and you ran out of, say, oxygen, then the hydrogen cannot burn any further. The amount of product is determined or limited by this reagent. Other reactions might be in excess and are not used up completely during the reaction. The limiting reagent determines the theoretical percentage yield of the reaction. Since theoretical yield, so it'll definitely affect your yield. If you run out of flour, your yield of bread is going to be limited. Since theoretical yield is defined as the amount of product that forms when the limiting reagent has reacted completely, we will use the example of the thermite reaction to further explain limiting reagents. Ooh, thermite. They used that in World War II. So they were trying to immobilize a huge gun on, say, the guns of Navarone or whatever. And they would use this thermite. The thermite reaction, 20 grams of aluminium is mixed with 65 grams of iron oxide and ignited to determine which substance is the limiting reagent. Okay, so here is the reaction for thermite. I've always been excited by this. Aluminium solid, 2 moles of it, plus 1 mole of iron oxide. Well, this is Fe2O3 solid, goes to form Al2O3, aluminium oxide plus iron, 2Fe liquid. Calculate the relevant formula masses to find the mass equation. So here we've got 2 times the molar mass of aluminium plus, there's your 2 ions and your 3 oxygens, goes to form, there's aluminium 2 again, 2 times 27, plus 3 times 16, goes to form 2 Fe's, and there's your 2 times the molar mass of iron. So there are the amounts. Choose one reactant A and calculate how many grams of the other reactant B are needed for A to react completely. If the available amount of B is more than the calculated amount of A, A is the limiting reaction. If the calculated amount of B is less than the actual amount, B is the limiting reagent. Calculate the number of moles of iron to oxide, O3, needed to react with 20 grams of aluminium. So have a look at this. What do we know so far? We know from the balanced equation that 54 grams of aluminium reacts with 159 grams of Fe2O3. 54, if 54 combines with 159, then 20, which is what we were given, combines with how much? So what we do is we say 20 upon 54 times 159.6, and that tells us it would combine with 59 grams of iron 2O3. But we were given 65 grams of iron oxide. So that means there's going to be excess iron oxide left over. So it's our aluminium that is going to be used up before the iron oxide. So therefore we use up all 20, but we're left with 59 from 65, and that is going to be 6 grams of iron oxide is going to be left over. And so that tells us that it is the aluminium is going to be the one that is used up, and therefore that is our limiting reagent. Well, 3 hours later, here is our loaf of bread. Look like this has no limiting reagents. It kind of worked. So there we go.